Are we in? Good evening and welcome to Gravenhurst Public Library and a presentation from Gravenhurst Archives entitled Gravenhurst, from rip-roaring lumbertown to cultural Mecca. And then I added today, do they have to be mutually exclusive? I'm not so sure they do. Tonight we're going to talk about the rather confused image of Gravenhurst, created by a very rugged, tough group of shanty men in the lumbering industry, the very lively cultural life of the community as created by its talented and very creative inhabitants, and the very negative image created by writers from other communities with the determination to keep Gravenhurst off the radar despite a wealth of attractive features. I think it would be useful to consider two sides of the image of Gravenhurst created in the early days of its settlement and perpetuated for reasons, a load of them, a variety of them, that is the image of Gravenhurst as a rip-roaring, hard-drinking lumber town, an image that was carried on long past the time when it might have applied. But let's remind our would-be critics, should they still remain, that where and how a community begins is seldom where it is found to be 150 years later. Let's also remind ourselves that we should be proud of those early loggers who lived in isolation in nasty conditions to clear the land and open up the countryside. And we should not be embarrassed that they came to town occasionally to let off some steam. I'd like to begin by, as usual, setting the scene and providing a context in time and place for the discussion that we're going to have about the evolving image of Gravenhurst. Initially, I'm going to talk predominantly about the period from 1860 to 1920. In other words, I'm looking at Gravenhurst from the time of its settlement, roughly 1860, to the beginning of its industrial period, marked by the end of the Great War in 1919 and the beginning of the rubber set in 1920. As we set the stage for our story, we are looking at a village that is being formed in the middle of a Victorian era. It spanned the years 1837 with the birth of Victoria, Queen Victoria, to her death in 1901. This time period is marked by a very stern and very straight-laced outward appearance of morality and gentility. It was all very well in cities and towns that had been settled for decades. But in the case of a brand new settlement in the wilderness, the people who would settle Gravenhurst had come with little or nothing at all and would have to eke out a living in the wilderness. Pamphlets on good behavior and keeping up appearances would have absolutely no relevance to Gravenhurst in the 1860s. I posted a couple of pictures here of the kinds of manuals that were around at the time of Victoria's era. I would guess that anyone who had to have a manual about how to behave or what was good behavior probably was trying to enter a class slightly above where society had placed him. I don't think most people used a manual. Once the initial decades of settlement were behind them, the people of cities like Toronto were doing their very best to try to create a society with standards of decent behavior and the appearance, at least, of gentility. Thus, in 1886, the Toronto Morality Department was formed as part of city government. The department would monitor such things as the length of women's skirts, women walking alone at night, which of course would invite danger to themselves or invite, what shall we call it, inappropriate behavior on the part of men. Theatrical performances to make sure that nothing of an immoral nature would be being performed on the stage. That could be a pretty broad range, I can tell you. And jitney dancing, or that popular trend of women dancing with men who would buy their drinks. Can't do any of those things. Even worse, Sundays. Sundays were policed all the way into the 1920s and in some cases beyond. Throughout the entire Victorian era and well beyond it, both making money and having fun on a Sunday was strictly forbidden. People were to attend church, and in some denominations, they were to go there more than once. They could visit family or close friends, but quiet conversation or prayer or reading from the Bible were the order of the day. Work, sports, movies, dancing, playing boisterously, all were strictly forbidden. And as for relationships, well, nothing but the most traditional were going to be allowed. All of these forbidden activities and relationships, if discovered, would bring arrest, charges, jail sentences, fines, and even physical punishment like whipping. In Gravenhurst, during the years between 1860 and 1920, settlement was only just beginning. Settlers quickly discovered that they could not eke out an existence by simply farming the land that they had settled on. The land itself had to be cleared with backbreaking work, and money had to be earned to buy food and the barest of necessities. Many settlers learned that they could work at logging camps all winter to make enough money to buy provisions for their families and to buy seed to plant in the spring as soon as the logging drive was over. In addition, young men were coming to Gravenhurst who were fit and healthy. And they came to the wilderness in search of jobs in lumber camps. In winter, they lived in camboose shanties in the camp. In summer, they lived in boarding houses owned by the mills, in the mill towns where all those logs would be processed, like Gravenhurst. Lumber camps had their very own strict rules, not for reasons of morality, but mostly for reasons of safety. No liquor was allowed because a clear head was needed from dawn to dusk. They actually worked from about, well, as soon as they could see what they were doing in the woods until they couldn't see any longer. So at least a 10-hour day. They had to have a clear head just to stay alive, just to stay unhurt. No cigarettes were allowed because of the danger of fire, but pipes were allowed because they were deemed to be safer. No women were allowed for 100 reasons I can think of, including the prospect of fights, disease, distraction, all of those things. Fun. No work was done on Sunday. Now, for some, that was a matter of actually keeping the Sabbath day, but for most, it was a matter of superstition. If you sharpened your axe on a Sunday, you would cut yourself badly on a Monday. It was absolutely believed. Starting around 1865, with the milling of pine for boards to plank the Muskoka Road, lumber mills would begin to spring up almost overnight. So that by 1880, over 17 mills would be operating at one time. 17 lumber mills in Gravenhurst, and another 3 or 4 just on the outskirts. A sawdust city was in the making. At this moment in time, our image was being formed in the various minds of the observers who were arriving in Gravenhurst. The beginning of the diverging image of Gravenhurst had its roots at this very moment. Already in 1876, Gravenhurst was becoming known in pamphlets and newspapers as Sawdust City. Was that a term of endearment or was it a sneer? It all depended upon the attitude, the prejudices, and the hidden agenda of the observer. An unbiased observer might emphasize the growth of the town and the lumber industry itself. He might even refer to Gravenhurst as the envy of the whole North. So in 1877, one observer said, so far, there have been no signs of any let up in the growth of the industry. People are already ready to start calling Gravenhurst Sawdust City. It seems probable that the town will soon have a dozen or more mills. Wildly underestimated. They would be cutting perhaps as many as 40 million feet of lumber per year in these mills, to say nothing of shingles. Gravenhurst was fast becoming the envy of the whole North, and the population was growing. In fact, another Northern Advance little article mentioned that houses are reported to be very scarce in Sawdust City. Not a surprise. But if the observer had only 1 or 2 lumber mills in his town, he might want to draw attention to the negative aspects of this booming town of Gravenhurst. He might want to emphasize the piles of sawdust, the whine of the saws and machinery, the overwhelming noise of the whole thing, suggesting that no one would want to live there. Here's how a different observer in the very same year characterized our town. Love to know his name, but it's a little late now. Gravenhurst is scarcely the sort of place likely to appeal to pleasure seekers right now. The shriek of the bandsaw and the hum of machinery set the tone in this town today. The red-shirted lumberjack, 6 feet of iron muscle from head to foot, indicating that the head is muscle as well, of course, dominates the scene here. The town really gets lively when those jacks come trooping in from the camps looking for liquor, women, and trouble, and usually finding all three. Woe betide the place that refuses to put up for them. Everything will be reduced to a shambles. It's interesting, isn't it? He observes that no one who is the right sort of person seeking a pleasant existence would ever want to consider living in Gravenhurst at all. After all, lumberjacks were dominating the town looking for liquor, women, and trouble, and your home was going to be in jeopardy. But at the same moment in town, Gravenhurst was sitting in a picturesque location between two lakes with all the potential in the world. By 1865, A.P. Coburn had already launched his first steamer on Lake Muskoka to take tourists and settlers up the string of Muskoka lakes. More steamers would quickly follow, and they would be based in Gravenhurst. As people began to seek out the beauty of this new region, accommodation was definitely going to be needed for the arriving multitudes. This town was going to need hotels, and lots of them. Our new visitors would vary in character and purpose too. Some were simply curious and had the luxury of being able to simply come to this new area and look around and see what all the fuss was about. Some of these people were merely passing through on a 2-week adventure in the wilderness, the canoe trip into the woods. Some of these people were looking for a new start in a very new location, a place to start their lives over, perhaps. Hotels sprang up to house and feed these first tourists, as well as the traveling salesmen who would follow them. It was a whole new kind of an economy for the wilderness, a joint venture among farmers, loggers, mill owners, merchants, ministers, and the regular folk. Those who could see the need for accommodation and the provision of meals had to get busy very fast. The first accommodation in Gravenhurst to be established was actually the log cabin home of James and Letitia McCabe in about 1861. We don't have a photograph of it, but I imagine you can all picture what a log cabin is looking like at this point. The couple had adopted the habit of taking in and feeding weary travelers who passed by, making the trek from Washago or Severn Bridge to Gravenhurst, or what was called at this time McCabe's Landing. The accommodation was pretty rough, but the McCabes improved the cabin and named it the Freemasons' Arms. And the people who trekked through the woods and got there finally were darn glad to find it and to find a place where they could lay their weary heads. McCabe and his wife would supply food, a drink, a bed, and even a scow to be kept on the shore of Lake Muskoka, where they could then journey out into the lake. But when Letitia died in 1867, Mickey McCabe lost heart and sold to a man named Horton, who soon sold to a man named Benjamin Fuller. He would rename this building the Queen's Hotel, and obviously it has been enlarged to a great extent from a log cabin, but the bare bones are there nonetheless, and that's the Queen's Hotel on the right. In 1884, the owner of the day, this is a few years later obviously, was refused a renewal of his license. We can only guess at the cause for that, and the Queen's Hotel was no more.
Who would be granting the license? Because at one time, was there actually a Gravenhurst?
Oh, there certainly was. Yep, 1862 was the time when we were named. 1877 is the time when we became incorporated as a village. So an incorporated village, of course, then was bylaws and regulations and rules and licenses and all the paraphernalia that goes with being a village or a town. So yeah, they had the right to do this. And well, it's not bad, is it? I mean, if you're thinking about coming and you don't have a whole lot of money in your pocket, that doesn't look too bad. And it's right at the south end of town. You might be happy to find that without worrying about having to go too much farther along. Another relatively newcomer to Sawdust City had seen the need for accommodation early on as well. Somewhere around 1865, Edward Cannell closed his railroad hotel located between Lethbridge, which is now Kilworthy, and Gravenhurst, and moved to town where he built a new hotel on the southwest corner of Muskoka Road at Bay Street. I want you to just think about where I'm talking about. It's the corner of Bay and Main Street. It's where the building that used to be Cottage Row is. It's been 100 other things. And it's now, I believe, a real estate office, and it's got very nice white trim on it and so on. Doesn't look anything like it did before. Oh, it was the Royal Bank. It was all kinds of things. It was Royal Bank when I came here for certain. So that's where he built his hotel. And it was variously called, depending on who was writing the story or whatever, the Railroad Hotel or the Muskoka Bay Hotel or the Northern Hotel. Whatever its name was, it certainly didn't last for very long. It lasted for fewer than 2 years before it burned to the ground. Compliments of Edward Cannell's little boy who was playing with matches in the upstairs room. He was rescued, but the family was burnt out and did not rebuild that hotel. They moved on actually up to an island in Lake Muskoka, and I think he got a much better job that didn't involve having to run a hotel. Dougal Brown, somebody whose name we know well, began construction of his Steamboat and Stage Hotel in 1867 on the northwest corner of Muskoka Road at Bay Street. Northwest corner is where the post office is. Okay, so that's what was there instead of what we have now. Although his venture was highly successful, Dougal was not really a fan of being a hotel keeper. He was much more interested in owning a livery business with his father-in-law's partner, or opening a beverage making and bottling company, which he particularly liked having, and in starting a lumber business, which he really never got too heavily involved in. He also had a free land grant of 100 acres, which he had subdivided into lots to be sold. So he had more irons in the fire than you could ever imagine. In 1876, Brown sold his hotel to a man named Henry Fraser, who then passed it on to his son, Alex Fraser. And the hotel was renamed the Fraser House. Alex Fraser wasn't too fond of the hotel business either. So in 1885, he sold the Fraser House to David Lafreniere. Now it says Lafreniere on there, but in actual fact, I think that might have been simply because they wanted to get in there the abbreviation for proprietor on the side of the building, but it was, and maybe didn't want it to look too French. That might have been a problem too. So anyway, they shortened it here to Lafreniere, but in fact it was Lafreniere. He renamed it again, Lafreniere Hotel. And in the photograph, you can see that this hotel bears both names, the Fraser House and Lafreniere. You can also see the group of men standing around down on the ground floor and up on the balcony, and then up on the upper balcony as well.
Where was it situated?
Where the post office is. Yeah. So that was where the Steamboat and Stage started out, and then it became, you know, this. In 1887, the Great Fire reduced it to rubble, but we will continue a story about this hotel in a few minutes. By now, you will have noticed that these hotels are being numbered by me, simply a way of indicating how many hotels we're going to end up with operating in Gravenhurst at the turn of the century. So we're at number 4 right now. The 4th hotel building to be erected was the Royal Hotel, also known as Cooper's Hotel, for the name of its owner, Emmanuel Cooper, and his 2 sons, George and James. It opened in 1871. Although the hotel was reviewed very favorably, very positive terms, in any of the travel brochures and so on that were around at the time, it would be remiss of me to leave out, as most of those brochures did, a description of some of the elements of the accommodations at the Royal Hotel. For one thing, the walls, the tables, and so on of all the public rooms, the living rooms, the dining room, the bar, were stuffed, full of stuffed birds and animals of the region. Dozens and dozens of them. They were on the walls, they were on the tables, they were on the bar, they were everywhere. And indeed, a full-grown black bear was kept chained near the sheds behind the hotel. And loggers who came to the hotel and imbibed a little too much of the spirits that were being served were only too eager to wrestle with that bear. Eventually, the poor bear died, probably of embarrassment more than anything. I don't know. He too was stuffed and added to the decor. In 1887, the Great Fire reduced the Royal Hotel to a depression in the ground, along with the barber shop and the dance hall, which appear in this photograph to the south of the Royal Hotel. The hotel was not rebuilt. That hotel was located where the TD Bank stands now. Wouldn't I love to dig under the TD Bank and see what the remainders are of that hotel? He sounds like a fun man, though. Best known, perhaps, but the fifth hotel was actually built a little later, and that was the Albion Hotel. The Albion was under construction by George Taylor in 1878 when his wife warned him to sell it lest he become its best customer. He sold it just before it opened in 1879 to Frank Wassley and a partner of Frank's, whom he would buy out very shortly. The Albion Hotel, like all the others that I've been describing thus far, was made of wood, with rooms for the traveling public, a commodious dining room, a bar, and bus service, as you can see, with the horses there in front of the building on the left, bus service down to the wharf, and so on. In 1887, it too burned to the ground in the Great Fire, but Wassley immediately rebuilt the hotel, this time of brick. He obviously hadn't read The Three Little Pigs in the first place, had he? I mean, if he had read it, he'd have known he should have started in brick. This time he built it of brick, and its central structure remains much as it was then today, except with a few additions and so on, and a few renovations and whatnot, but pretty much looks the same, except I'd love to see those awnings back again. I love that look. Number 6. The Caledonian Hotel was actually a combination of a hotel and a general store, built and run by a man named James Sharp, one of our very earliest settlers, along with his son, John. When the Great Fire destroyed the hotel in 1887, John immediately rebuilt the hotel with some capital funds from a partner named Chin. Yeah, $1 a day, can you imagine? That was the going rate. I think just about all of these were in that neighborhood of $1 to $1.50 a day. Now, mind you, when you think about what a person made in the way of wages, $1 was starting to look, you know, as much as you'd want to pay, I guess. The rebuilt hotel was renamed the Empress. Upon the death of John Sharp, the hotel was run by the Chin family until they sold, or at least they thought they'd sold, in 1906 to James Gilmore. Just as they were trying to dry the ink on the sales agreement, Gilmore relinquished the hotel immediately and moved away, and the hotel reverted to the Chins. In 1919, Gilmore returned to Gravenhurst, repurchased the Empress Hotel, and renamed it the Gilmore Hotel, a place of legend for those of us who have lived here long enough. The hotel had a succession of owners after that, culminating in 1984 when it was sold to R.K. Hutton, who converted it into apartments and businesses. And it's a beautiful store and apartments today. Doesn't really look anything like that photograph indicates. I didn't put a picture of the Gilmore in. I thought maybe it was best to leave it as it is here, looking rather attractive. And you notice that at the top of the building, you can see Empress Hotel is there on the brick. By now, you'll have noticed there were congregations of men standing about at the various hotels that we've been looking at. Some would be commercial travelers, some would be lumbermen, some would be loggers, some would be tourists, but it is clear that there was a very real need for hotels in this town, a number of them, not simply for their well-stocked bars, as some might indicate, but for the accommodation that they would provide to the traveling public. After all, Gravenhurst was fast becoming the hub of transportation for all those who would enter and exit Muskoka Lakes region. The 8th hotel that I'm going to talk about is the Windsor Hotel. This hotel provides the continuation of the story of the steamboat and stage, the Fraser House that became the Lafreniere House before becoming a pile of ashes. In 1888, David Lafreniere rebuilt the hotel almost immediately, and he called it the Windsor Hotel. The Windsor was successful from 1888 until 1903, when it caught fire and burned to the ground. It was not rebuilt. The photograph is a chilling reminder that even brick hotels could burn to the ground. That was in the same location as the steamboat and stage, so it was right where the post office is today.
The previous slide
Mm.
showed it says Hotel de Windsor.
Yeah, I know.
Now, was that just embellishing it, or did we have a large French?
No, we did not have a large French community, and even most of the loggers in our area were not French, although many loggers were. They just didn't happen to have all come here. They were mostly in the Ottawa Valley, but in fact, we had a few. No, La Frontière, however, was French.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so it may have been his idea of making it sound a little more Tony,
Yeah.
you know, of doing that. Windsor Hotel was not an uncommon name for hotels in those days, and he may have been attempting to, you know, ramp up the the image. The last hotel, the ninth hotel, is the most frustrating one of all to discuss. The Grand Central Hotel was apparently both grand and central, since it was located right where the Opera House is today. It opened in about 1882 under the proprietorship of Kenneth Cameron. In 1885, he sold the hotel to Joseph Boyd, and of course, it perished in the Great Fire. No photograph has yet been found of this hotel, although Archives Ontario has labeled a photograph that they have in their collection as the Grand Central Hotel in Gravenhurst. In fact, it's not accurate. This hotel that they've labeled is actually located in Haliburton. Same name. After the Great Fire, it appears that a much reduced structure was built and bore the same name. It was located to the south of the Opera House and looks more like an unpretentious house, large but unpretentious. Boyd lodged an action or a lawsuit against the town of Gravenhurst for a breach of promise concerning the cladding of the building in brick, which he would do, in return for a license, which they would give. Neither of these things happened. It didn't materialize. And I don't have any information about the outcome of the lawsuit, but I can only guess that he was not successful. Although each of the hotels we've looked at was equipped with a bar, that was not necessarily its central feature. The next series of slides is going to provide you with a quick glimpse of several bars and restaurant counters that existed in the hotels in Gravenhurst between 1890 and 1920. And they're not very tawdry looking, all concerned. I mean, when you think about the kinds of things that were said about all the fights and whatnot, you might think that these are going to be a little bit scummy looking, but they're not. That's the hotel, or sorry, the station bar. You can see that they have a limited amount of liquor, but that's the station bar in the original train station, which burned down in 1913. That's the one that was down at the south end of town, pretty much close to where the gateway is now. So about the condition of that, but that's how it came to us. Glad to have it. When the train station moved up to where it presently is, sort of at the corner of Brocken and Bethune, that GTR station had a new and very much enhanced collection of bottles, I might add, bar. And we have a couple of pictures of that bar. And it looks like they have 3 employees as well. The station, the new station, also had a restaurant. And I love the seats, those folded up. Can you believe it? I don't know why I've never seen that anywhere, except that maybe they're not very comfortable. I don't know. No backs on them, but still, what a great idea. No movement of chairs. You can clean underneath them without having to do anything. I thought that was just a super idea. And even when they redid the interior of the station restaurant, they kept still that counter and those seats. Notice how Tony it was in there. I mean, the tables all have white tablecloths and white napkins and so on. So it was quite a nice little spot. That's our train station, which, by the way, we have very wisely, with a struggle, preserved. So we have not, in fact, lost that piece of our heritage. This is a photograph of the bar in the Caledonian Hotel, although one of the copies of this photo that we have is labeled as the Windsor. But in a moment, you'll see why I don't think that that could be true. And then in fact, this is the Caledonian, and it did burn down in 1887. So this picture predates it. This reinforces some of the stories of rough and rowdy, hard drinking Gravenhurst. And we're going to take a look at that story.
Is that a spittoon?
Oh, yes, it is. It's one of those ceramic ones. Everybody's, yeah. Everybody had a chaw in the corner of the mouth. Got rid of it all the time. Yeah, everybody had spittoons. I mean, there were, in those days, if you had someone who smoked or chewed tobacco, you had to have a spittoon. You know, it just was necessary. My grandfather had one. We did not keep it as an antique. I just couldn't quite bear the idea. Anyway, the man on your left in this picture, that rather portly looking gentleman on the left of the spittoon, is in fact a man named Matt Watson, and we're going to hear his story in a moment. The story of Matt Watson is a story of a man who is strong and not afraid of a fight if he has to have one, although he's not likely to ever instigate one, and his handling of a press gang in 1882. A press gang was a gang of louts that would go from one tavern to another, one town to another, and they would go in and terrorize the people who were in there, whether they be the employees or the drinking public, and demand free drinks, or else they would rain mayhem on the group and the hotel. It reinforces some of those stories of rough and rowdy, but that's not really the fault of Gravenhurst, because these people wandered in. Matt Watson was apparently reputed to be the man at the left in that Caledonian bar. He was typical of the kind of man who so often worked in lumber camps. He was over 6 feet tall. He was extremely strong, not easily riled, very calm, but not afraid of a fight if there was a just cause. I've left the grammatical errors, by the way, in that article. It's just as it was written. This story, interestingly enough, appears in relationship to Uffington and Port Carling. So it seems to me that this is the kind of story they would trot out when you wanted to reinforce the notion that some place, Uffington, Gravenhurst, was a rough spot. The local newspapers at the time originated mainly in Aurelia and Bracebridge, until Alf Dass came along to Gravenhurst in about 1920 and took over the publishing of the Banner, or at least got it up and running in 1920. And he published the Banner for the next 40 years. It was our local paper. It had an even-handed view of our community and its activities. Now, interestingly enough, the next story you're going to see is never really found in any publications, but it relates to a very similar incident in Bracebridge. Shocking though that might be for your sensibilities. Get my little trusty fingernail going here. Turn my pages. In 1883, lumbermen were passing through Bracebridge, and as they saw women on the streets, they called out obscene comments to the women and did enough of the general creation of havoc to get themselves arrested and charged. But the charge would automatically result in a fine, and they refused to pay. So a fight between the constables and the shantymen became a brawl, and 5 lumbermen were arrested. Several of them escaped, broke out of jail, and then broke back into jail and freed their companions, and then went and celebrated in a local hotel. Now, if we would like to take the collective IQ of this group, of course, I think it might be a good idea. Going back to a locale to drink right in town is not a good idea. Somehow stories like these did not appear in the towns where they occurred. And these gentlemen, I use the term loosely, were rearrested, escaped again, and assisted the other comrades who had not escaped by feeding them whiskey through the bars of the cells. I mean, I love it, in the windows. You know, I mean, just classic. It's clear that legislating morality in a lumber town, or even in a developing town, would not be an easy thing to do. At the same time, however, our mayor, Joseph Claremont, in 1912, did decide to try to at least legislate some of the morality that was going on. Now, I have to laugh. In the 1890s, apparently people were prone to bathing in Gull Lake without their bathing suits. I know, it's frightening. But anyway, that was, stopped, and they were going to be fined and jailed and whatnot. But in 1912, bylaw number 460 made it clear that you were not to do any kind of swearing whatsoever. Bad language, indecent, blasphemous, or grossly insulting language was going to be a problem. And you were not allowed to be drunk and disorderly upon the streets of the town. If you did any of these things, you would end up with either a substantial fine of $25 and court costs, or if you didn't have the money to pay it, you would be going to jail. The story of a developing community and image of Gravenhurst would add yet another layer in 1875, as well as add another source of envy in the minds of the people who did not live here. Not only were we situated on two lakes with stagecoaches based here, steamships based here, making it a transportation hub, now as if to add insult to injury, in 1875, we were about to take a huge leap forward with the coming of the railroad. And there it is, that poor, dear little steam engine chugging along between in the gap or the pass, bringing to the attention of all the passengers on board the train the fact that they were now in the land of the Canadian Shield. And I'm sure that everybody on there went, when they realized that this is where they actually owned a piece of free grant land, and it might be going to look like that. I can't even imagine what they said to themselves. Society in Gravenhurst would change in so many ways with the advent of the railroad in 1875. Gravenhurst would, for a starter, become the northernmost terminus of the GTR. Well, at first it started as the Northern Railway and then the GTR for the next 10 years. And the tracks would not push further north until 1885. Oh, the envy. The train would bring countless visitors to the town, although most of them were not really staying. They were heading for the spur line to the wharf, where they could simply walk across the wharf from the train to the steamers that were waiting there, and those steamers would ferry them up the lakes to their summer homes or to resorts or wherever. Gravenhurst, in fact, remained a rail hub for a very long time past this moment of 1875, even after the train travel had proceeded north into the Nipissing district and beyond. We had switching yards, we had a roundhouse, we had coal and water, we had rail crews. They were all here. The conductors and the men and the linemen and the firemen on the trains all lived in Gravenhurst. And the reason was that their shifts started and ended here. So the house that I live in, for example, was owned by a conductor, and he could simply walk down to the tracks and hop on the train as the other conductor hopped off, and on he would go. Well, even the future King of England came to Gravenhurst in 1919 to open the brand new and second train station, another piece of our heritage which we have managed to preserve. And in the beginning, when the tracks were to be continued north, rail construction crews were based in Gravenhurst too. Off Main Street, yes. It's sort of, Violet Street is the end of the Anglican cemetery down there. And if you were to follow that back in, or there's another one there called Main, going back in there, you're getting really close to where the train station was located, that first one, yeah. The people of Gravenhurst had absolutely probably no idea the benefits that the train to come here were going to bring to them, but they celebrated its arrival joyously nonetheless. The Aurelia Times, we were always covered. Our history, our events, everything going on in Gravenhurst was always well covered in Aurelia newspapers. And in the Aurelia Times of 1875, I think our orientation was to the south rather than to the north for a very long time. This is what was printed about the fact that we had the train. First of all, the description goes on to talk about all the officials who were there. There were MPs and there were, the owner of the railway and so on. They had a wonderful dinner. They all toasted each other, with alcohol and so on. It was lovely. And then it was over at 5 o'clock and they all went home on the train that was going south. But people of Gravenhurst didn't see it quite that way. People from the whole district had crowded in to see with their own eyes that first train. Local celebrations did not break up at 5 p.m. That night, the local bars were filled with the excitement of achievement. Millmen, lumbermen, rivermen, construction men, all whooping it up. It was reported that James Baskerville and Thomas Grant of Gravenhurst fought off at least 20 of the construction men and held their own. Before dawn, everybody had finally gone to sleep. I never think that any of these sound like terrible riots of any kind. They don't sound like something that would inspire fear in your heart. They sound like people who celebrated more joyously than they should have. So now you've got the potential of a lot of different kinds of people coming together for a good barroom brawl. You've got loggers, steamer crews, construction crews, and all you have to do is get people from any 2 or 3 of those groups in the same bar at the same time, and by golly, you've got the making of an argument. And an argument is going to turn into me, as it is. So in fact, these oft described fights might include yet another group of people now, with these crewmen from the steamships, the crewmen from the construction crews of the railroad, and even some of the men working on the railroad as well. But all of the write-ups of these various incidents make one thing very clear. When a brawl or a major fight broke out, it would be recorded in the paper or in some literature about the town, and it would appear that at most, only one of these incidents was ever likely to occur in a year. I mean, this wasn't going on a weekly basis. Sometimes you got that feeling when you were reading newspapers from some of our, what should we call it, neighboring towns. But in actual fact, if you actually read between the lines, the loggers weren't allowed to leave camp every Saturday. My goodness, and in some cases, they were so far out in the bush, they've never gotten here. No, they'd have been Monday, they'd have been still coming into town trying to get here when they had to be at work at 5 in the morning. So in actual fact, this was a gift to them sometimes to be allowed to come to town. And they knew they were going to be letting off some steam, but my caption on the next slide is probably going to call into question my own moral judgment and gentility, but this story really captured my imagination. I've superimposed the words over an image of the length of Muskoka Road so that I can describe to you and you can kind of visualize a description of a brawl that lasted for 9 hours and covered 6 blocks of our main street. Over 50 men were involved in the fight. No one died. No one was arrested because, as you will see, if you look at the last line there, all of the police made no attempt to bring anybody under control and took cover at their own homes. They weren't foolish enough to try to take on any of these people who would really know how to fight. Considering that it was fought on May 24th, I don't have the year, a day to celebrate the birth of Queen Victoria, it can only beg the question, did anyone tell Victoria about it? Given her love of Scotland and its rugged Highland shepherd, she might have really enjoyed a story like this. Which brings me to yet another one of my little comments. These are my little own editorial comments. They're not the views of Gravenhurst Archives. The one who writes the story shapes the history. One well-chosen incident at a time, and one well-chosen adjective at a time. All of this talk of rough and violent Gravenhurst should encourage us to keep in mind that depending upon how you decide as a writer to portray the characteristics of a town, you can really influence the people who might want to come and live there, open a store there, whatever. The writer has an audience, he's got a motivation, and sometimes he's got a hidden agenda. We would do well to examine how these stories influenced the perception of Gravenhurst as time went on. It's not very easy to see. Well, it's not bad, I guess, there. Mine is a little less easy on my screen. This is an excerpt from a tourist brochure that was written in 1901. There were so many pamphlets and tourist brochures, I couldn't have put them all on a bookshelf. I mean, they were just written constantly. They weren't written by people in Gravenhurst, I might mention. I think we were too busy working. I don't think we had time to, now the navigation company wrote a lot of them. But then the navigation company, with the exception of, well, even A.P. Coburn didn't live here, his father did, and his brothers. But most of the Whigs in the navigation company didn't really live here. So if they were getting somebody to write publicity, it might not have been a Gravenhurst person. In this excerpt from the tourist brochure in 1901, there's only one reference to Gravenhurst, and it's written in that particular way. Now, this is a brochure that's describing townships and towns, and you're a tourist, you're going to want to, this is where you're going to want to go, this place, that place, and so on. This is what Gravenhurst got. A town passed about a mile before reaching Muskoka Wharf is worthy of mention. At Muskoka Wharf, the commodious and trim steamers of the navigation company are awaiting the train. On alighting, there is little to suggest the beauties and delights beyond. And one is impatient to leave the buzz of the busy sawmills and rafts of logs, which are in evidence in the immediate vicinity. As soon as the passengers and baggage are transferred to the steamers, one of which proceeds to the head of Lake Joseph and the other one to the head of Lake Rosso, the lines are cast off and the boats start on a lake journey, and all those nasty, unsightly sawmills are left in the dust behind, right? And the vistas of gorgeous beauty are going to unravel before you or unfold before you. I think we can take it for sure that it wasn't written by anyone in town. I would say that in this case, we know what the attitude and the prejudice, shall we say, of the writer implies here. Gravenhurst in the eye of the beholder contains absolutely no beauty whatsoever, only unsightly logs and mills. It's just noisy, and it's just a place you want to get out of as fast as you can possibly go. I portrayed here two documents that were extremely popular, extremely useful, and read widely. The one was about the free grant lands, which came available. The publication was written in 1871, but the free grant lands were opened for settlement in 1868. The man who wrote it is a man named Thomas McMurray, and he lived in Bracebridge. On the right is the guidebook and atlas of Muskoka and Parry Sound districts. It has been printed and reprinted copiously. It was written in 1879 by a man named W.E. Hamilton, who lived in Horace, anyone? Bracebridge? Yeah. I wanted to draw to your attention what can happen when the description of a town is manipulated by the author or the publisher of literature. Each page in this book, and it's a beautiful book, the originals are absolutely lovely, bound, hardbound book. Each page has 2 columns of information running down it, and it's very detailed. Gravenhurst warrants 1/2 column, so that's 1/4 of a page. Bracebridge warrants 11 columns, that's 5.5 pages. Does it give you an idea that if somebody is picking up a book called A Guidebook and Atlas of Muskoka to see where they might want to go, that they might be looking at the long description and not the short description? It behooved Mr. Hamilton, by the way, to do that because he was a land agent in Bracebridge and its surrounding townships. So it behooved him to promote his town, and at the very least to not promote the town of Gravenhurst. It was not only his job, but it was money in his pocket as well. Do I sound like I'm on a campaign here? Yes, I do. I like to think of Gravenhurst between 1860 and 1920 as a town where earning your living was not easy, but it was not so hard as to be unattractive to a settler. We were a blend of lumbering, farming, tourism, and healthcare, being those 4 sanatoriums that treated tuberculosis in Canada. And we did have a strong community culture. And in the very beginning, I asked the question, were we, or should we see ourselves as a site of riotous behavior and too much drinking? Or can we look at ourselves as a cultural mecca? In actual fact, it depends, I'm sure, on how you view culture. So what is culture, in fact? Well, too often, I think, people use the word culture and they use it really badly. They overuse it as well. And they use it with some kind of implication that it is about concerts, art galleries, the right kind of music, classical only, please. And that is what culture is all about. That's not what it is. It's a much overused word. Too often it's used as a measuring stick to measure the value and worthiness of people and their activities. And it's used to separate out classes of people who don't measure up. In fact, the culture of a group of people or a region or a country or a race is really a collective noun that holds within it the history, the customs, the beliefs, the values, the attitudes, the sum of all its arts, music, drawing, painting, dance, particular way of life, and a shared worldview. So in fact, it has nothing to do with the right kind of music, the right kind of art. It has to do with what do you share in common with your community such that you could call yourselves a community having a culture, and your culture will be influenced by a whole lot of things. If a pioneer community comes together to build a school with the work of their very own hands, then that's an indication that that education is valued in the culture of that community. For those who would have viewed Gravenhurst as uncultured in the early decades of its existence, I would suggest a quick examination of a few facts. We built the first school in Gravenhurst in 1864. It was a log school. It was where the North Ward School, for those who've lived here for a long time, was located. That's on Winewood, if you know the street Winewood, where Kentucky Fried Chicken is, but over actually where that big gray sort of 3 or 4 story office and apartment building is. It was located right about there. It was built by 5 very, I would say, prominent settlers in Gravenhurst, who actually cut down the trees, hewed the logs, and built the school with their own bare hands. Now, that to me is an indication of the value of education in a culture, because these men were 5 of the men who had land grants in the community. So Joseph Brock and John Sharp and so on. Amazing. In 1871, the North Ward School continued to act as the sort of town hall, you might say, as well as a school. And a series of readings were held in the North Ward School to packed audiences, it says. It included recitations, dialogues, scenes from plays, songs featuring local people like Thomas Robinson, who is perhaps the most cultivated, not cultured, cultivated of settlers who came to Gravenhurst, and James Kirkpatrick, who was the owner of a major store and part of a lumber mill. In 1871, we had our first full-scale regatta. 1872, a new log school was built because the other one burned down. In 1875, a town hall was built. We had a debating and literary society as early as 1876, if you're valuing those things in your own personal sense of culture. And in 1879, the new Central Public School was completed and opened. If in fact you think of a system of beliefs or shared beliefs in a community as being part of its culture, then in fact Gravenhurst had it in spades. We started building our churches almost the moment we got here. In 1865, what was variously called the Episcopal, the Anglican, or the English church was under construction. And that's that little wooden building on the left. It's log, it's got stumps everywhere around it, and it has a little fence to try to keep the cattle from roaming in and out. In fact, the cattle at that time were probably roaming in and out on the main street as well. But it's a way kind of down, not too far actually from where the present gateway is. There's the Anglican cemetery there across the road.
That had been the cemetery for that church at the time?
It was.
Oldest cemetery?
No, it's not, interestingly enough. We'll be talking about that in a later date. In actual fact, the land for that Episcopal church or Anglican or English church was donated by James McCabe, and for the cemetery as well. He simply went chunk, 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 and said, this is for you. He wasn't Anglican, by the way, he was Catholic. In 1877, the Knox Presbyterian Church, which is the third from the left, second from the right, with that beautiful steeple on it and the board and batten siding, Knox Presbyterian Church was established. In 1877, the Methodist Church was also established. It's the one on the right-hand side. That's the original one where the United Church is now. So it was literally across the street from Knox. When Presbyterian and Methodist congregations united, much to the chagrin of some people, it then became the United Church of Canada. But some people said, oh, no, not in my lifetime, and went right on having Knox Presbyterian Church. And the Catholic Church, St. Paul's Roman Catholic Church, which is now that big, splendiferous, modern-looking affair, opened in 1878, and it's the one second from the left. That's a little better representation of it than it might have had at that time. In actual fact, it was torn down, and the new church was built where the rectory was, and the rectory was built where the church was. So if you can picture them switching on that same piece of land. Again, in actual fact, there are a lot of indications of the kind of culture, the kind of values, the kinds of things that we considered important to us here. The first newspaper only lasted for a year, was called the Lumberman, but in fact, it didn't last. But it wouldn't be all that long, I guess it's 40 years later, that we ended up getting a permanent newspaper. There were several in between that didn't last, and then we, with Alf Das in 1920, we got Alf Das and a newspaper. But the town band formed in 1881, and they had instruments, and that's amazing to me. And maybe somewhere on this slide, but I don't, oh yes, yes I do. That first band shell erected on the northwest corner of Muskoka Road at Sharp, so just up the street from where we're standing, so actually just down the street, oh, I don't even know where I am. I'm standing at the sort of corner of Sharp and Muskoka Road and kind of close to John. So, you know, in that spot there, that's where the first band shell was erected. Now, it was torn down in order to make way for the Opera House, the construction thereof, and the clerk's office and so on. And so the band shell was moved around a bit, and eventually it ended up in Gull Lake Park. So we did have a band shell as early as 1896. We had a library association established in 1883. Didn't mean we got a library that early. Oh, no. No, no, no. Our council was a little bit deleterious, shall we say, in its approach to getting a library, and did a very bad job of negotiating with Andrew Carnegie. And as a result, we ended up with not only the last Carnegie library to be built, but the smallest Carnegie library to be built, but not until 1923. We got the land for a new Central Public School. It moved, land for West Ward School, a Parks Association. So these are the things that our community culture was showing as being valuable to us. We became a town in 1887. It was a village in 1877. High school classes were held in that North Ward Public School starting in 1889. That's early for a high school. And in 1896, the first Gravenhurst High School was completed and opened. Looks to me like education was pretty important. It seems as though maybe more important than just about anything else in our culture. And I'm not sad about that, because as a former teacher, of course, I think that that's exactly the way it ought to be. Finally, I come to what we might consider to be the center of our culture in Gravenhurst. Some people will take exception to it, as they did when it was being built. People would walk past it in 1900 and call out, "How's Mickle's Folly coming along?" Because Charles Mickle was the mayor at the time, and it was he who said, after the town hall had burned down in 1897, it was he who said, "We need something more than just your average old town hall. We need something that will allow us to do a whole lot of things." And we had a lot of people in this town who really liked to act. We had a lot of people who loved to stage little plays, one-act plays. I read an account of a group that tried Hamlet at one point, and apparently it was not successful. But generally speaking, very popular, all the productions that they did. It was the town hall, this opera house, for 67 years. It held all the council meetings because it had the council chambers. It had the town staff for a while, had all the town meetings. So whenever they had to have a meeting to pass a debenture, for example, or whatever, because the citizens had to vote on any large spending of money. Boy, don't you wish that was true today. Honest to Pete. Anyway, I'm sure I can't work that into the election right now, but they had to vote. So citizens had to come together and they had to vote. And if you got, if you got it turned down, it was done. It was dead in the water. You weren't doing it. So an amazing place where those things could occur. Mm-hmm. There was, right from the start. Now, if you think about Aurelia and Aurelia's opera house, and they had one much earlier. They built their opera house, I think it was 1886, and it was much bigger and much more grand. I forget the number of people it could hold in its theater capacity. I think it was like more than 1,000 people. It was huge. It had a great big balcony. Guess what? Fire. Yeah, I mean, you just know that that's what's going to happen. And in fact, it was burned out like a shell. And so they reconstructed it, but the people would not vote the amount of money it would take to replicate the original opera house at that point. So they voted the amount of money that would build a much scaled down sort of version. Now, mind you, it's still a beautiful opera house in Aurelia, wonderful. And they've actually got now 2 theaters, a small and a large theater in there. Wonderful place. But in fact, they have a bit of a similarity in look. There's a bit of a, crossover there. And when we decided we needed a town hall, I would not be at all surprised if people didn't take a good long look at Aurelia and what was going on there. Well, I read somewhere that it was, but then I was looking at the architect for our opera house, and it wasn't the name of the one in Aurelia. So I'll have to talk to the Historical Society in Aurelia and ask them what the dirt is on that, because I think that there's a relationship maybe to the newer one that was built, the second rendition. You can see, by the way, the clerk's office is sitting back behind the opera house. That's the little clerk's office. That, in fact, was where the town clerk was. He also had the weigh scales for the market in there. And so when people had to, like if somebody was bringing a heifer to market, it got weighed on the town scales, which were attached to the clerk's office. And you can see the mechanism that went down when the cow or steer stepped on it. And then it was recorded inside. Then they knew what to charge the person, et cetera, et cetera. That, by the way, is still sitting.
And over the time I've lived here, there's been at least 2 different times when some people wanted to rip down the opera house.
Oh, you're right.
Yes.
Oh, you are right.
Yes, at least twice.
At least twice. At least twice. You're
at
right.
Least, yes. And you have to.
Yeah, well, you just
One of
thank
the
God. Yeah, you can't even imagine how we managed to get away with that one, because they were adamant that it was going to be torn down.
Yes,
Yeah.
it was terrible.
Hugh Bishop was the mayor at the time. of one of these, and that's the name of Bishop Street, which is the street over behind me. And he was the man who wanted to tear it down and put up a shopping mall.
Oh, boy.
1967. I think to myself, holy smokes, we could have ended up with, with a shopping mall right there on our corner. Can you imagine what?
Yeah, the donkey shack right there.
Absolutely. Yeah, right. Oh, anyway, we're lucky because again, it's another piece of our history that we have managed to hang on to. And in fact, we've managed to even make it better and better. And with Fred Schultz in the mix now, I have every hope that that will once again become a hub for cultural activities in the town. That means children's recitals, for example, which should not be being held somewhere where you've got to pay $1 million to get in. Children's recitals, things from the high school, plays and art shows, that's our kids, right? Those are our people. We shouldn't have to pay more than a few bucks to be able to do that, and the town should be able to live with that. They shouldn't be looking at trying to make money all the time.
I
On
remember
this.
being there with the youth of the
Mhm.
town, and
Mhm.
I don't know, they wanted me, we would do little productions.
Mhm.
Didn't even cost us money to use.
To
the
use it,
building.
no.
And, it was grand.
And it's so often it's now become prohibitive for anybody who wants to
Yeah.
use it. I mean, they simply can't afford to. I'm hoping though, under Fred, because I think Fred can be very persuasive with council, that he will be able to have the ultimate say in this. The Opera House opened on the 12th of March, 1901. And despite the fact that a few people had said, Mecca's folly and all the other pejorative comments, in fact, the whole town came together for the celebration. The sheer number of people who were involved in plays and songs and everything else on the stage that night, phenomenal. And I think the only person that wasn't in favor of the Opera House opening is a little boy sitting on the floor at the left who looks very annoyed with the whole thing. He says, what am I doing here? Yeah. But pretty cute. And we have the names of all of those people. And you would be surprised to see some of those names because in fact, some of those families are still here.
It's so sweet.
Isn't that beautiful? That Opera House has been at the cultural heart of Gravenhurst for so many decades. And I'm not just talking again about culture that means concerts or that means art galleries and so on. It's the things of the people that are being staged there because they're important to them. And so look at all the things that have gone on there. I love the fact that we had Miss Pankhurst here delivering a suffragette lecture. That's fantastic. And some of the women would have loved it. Some of the men would have hated it. And it was the recruitment center for both wars. All the high school dramas used to be there, high school concerts. Maybe one of the really important things on a national scale is the fact that before 1934, there was no summer theater in Canada. And so this is the home, our Opera House, of summer theater in Canada. And it was brought to us by a man named John Holden, who had the Good Companions Group Theater Company. And then he changed the name after a year to the Actors Colony. And then eventually we had the Straw Hat Players. And when you look at the list of some of the people who acted in early plays here, I see the Opera House as paving the way for them to have a career. Donald Sutherland, Helen Shaver, Robertson Davies, Timothy Finley, Don Heron, they were all acting in plays here. And in fact, Donald Sutherland began as a carpenter building stage props and then said, please, could I act too? And yes, Gordon Lightfoot sang here regularly, Maureen Forrester. Now, so we've got Gordon Lightfoot, wonderful folk singer, and right beside him is Maureen Forrester, incredible opera singer, and Michael Burgess.
One night when I was ushering, Otto Preminger came into the theater to one of the plays.
He was,
Yes.
Yep.
he did.
he was here to scope out
Oh,
the story of Bethune. And it was in fact Donald Sutherland who was going to act the part of Norman Bethune. So Preminger, I don't think that he actually had anything to do with the production in the
No,
end,
no,
but he was just here.
he was just here
Yep.
as a visitor.
And I think he was
Yes, I
kind of looking
spoke with
around.
him, yeah.
Yeah. Yeah,
Yes.
imagine, eh? And I mean, we can only imagine who some of the people were who wandered in and out of here.
People said, how did you recognize him?
Oh.
And I just, he was so recognizable.
Yes,
Yeah,
exactly. He would be.
yes.
Yeah, not a small man.
No.
No. No, not a
And
small
it
man.
was nice to talk to.
We had a number of theater companies of our very own, though we didn't rely on professional theater. We had theatrical companies with as many as 40 actors in them. And I put some of the names down, just the last names. I put Kay Pontus down just because I think she was at the very head of the line in that group, but also names like Jones, Draper, Pinkerton, McCann, Torelli, Jackson, Rutledge, Husselstrom, Bradley, Passmore, Hawker. These were all people, Profers and Robinsons, who acted in plays in our town. And again, a local production of Our Town, which is all about the workings of a small town and its problems, was produced in 1973. And look at the list of people who acted in it. People who knew Peter Stewart in late life would have been surprised at that. But in fact, he was a very, very popular actor. Cyril Fry, no surprise there. Art Hill, Peter Scott, John Christensen, Iris Simmons, and many, many more. I put the names in because I think we need to remember some of these people that we've known and that did these things. The Howard Cable Orchestra used to play here sometimes. We bought a Steinway concert grand. Gordon Sloan engineered that one. Wowzers, that is some machine. You don't pick up a Steinway concert grand for a couple of bucks. No. The Royal Canadian Air Force was here. And well, Jim Grow acted in everything that was moving. I mean, and the little group of Lions Little Theater of 9 one-act plays group that I've listed there, Jim Grow, John Torelli, Harry Ferry, Bill Rothery, and Dr. Luke Irwin, their acting was so strong that they were invited by Hart House Theater at U of T to come there and present the play that they had seen here in Gravenhurst. Now that's kind of special. I mean, I don't think everybody gets invited to act at Hart House, or
Roger,
certainly
Roger,
then.
you performed here, didn't you?
I have, yeah.
Yeah.
There you go.
Part of theater.
Well,
Yeah.
you're just waiting in the wings for that. You're waiting in the wings.
I've performed, but
Oh, but was it on the stage? Where were you? Where were you?
The Witch and the Wizard of Oz.
Oh, wonderful. Oh, the best
On
part.
oh,
Oh,
in tap shoes.
in
You know, my
top
dances,
shoes.
it was my dance.
Oh, my dear. I wish I'd seen that.
It was great.
Something I haven't mentioned before, and I'm going to conclude with it because it's just so recently that the walkway out to the barge has been named the Fred Schultz Walkway. And it's just so recently that we've gotten Fred back involved again in Music on the Barge. Music on the Barge really began in about 1949. And I just have to dig out the material that tells us that. And it was a movable, mobile platform. It was a barge, and you took it out and you anchored it, you acted on it, you brought it back in again. And it wasn't until people had said, this is really good, we really like having this. That's how a culture defines actions and things in a community. And the people, well, you can see them there in that photograph. And sure, lots of them are summer visitors, but lots of them are local. The barge eventually became a permanently anchored, refurbished fixture, which was opened for the second or third time on the 4th of July in 1959 by the Queen and Prince Philip. It's been managed for most of its life, well, not really most of its life, but a great part of its life, by Fred Schultz, who always has understood so well what the culture of Gravenhurst is all about. And I'm really glad, for one, that he's back at the helm. And that poster up there is one of the very first posters advertising Music on the Barge. We have a set of about 8 or 10 posters like that. I think it's so colorful, so beautiful. Yeah, it's a super thing.
Who designed it?
I have no idea. There's nothing on it saying designed by or anything. Nope. And they were just given to us as sort of in a bag. boy, do I ever love it when those days happen. In the end, I think we can conclude that our community has evolved and grown as our culture has also evolved and grown. I think we should be proud of the fact that we had loggers and lumbermen who first put Gravenhurst on the map with 17 and eventually about 21 lumber mills. And who cares if after long, long days out in the woods, weeks and weeks and weeks, living in very difficult circumstances, if they finally got the chance to come to town and let off a little steam, I think nobody was ever really badly hurt. But by knowing where we've come from, the loggers, the lumbermen, the trainmen, all of these people, by knowing where we've come from and how we've evolved, I think we can much better map where we want to go from here. Because if you don't know where you've been, you certainly don't know where you're going to head for. And I mean, culturally and developmentally, our planning, we don't need any more strategic plans. I think we just probably need to figure out what we should be doing, what we should be prizing in the community, what we should be valuing that speaks on our behalf to our culture in the town of Gravenhurst. And that is basically the end of my talk. Does anybody have questions? Are there any questions online?
I just wanted to make a comment.
Yes.
The biggest brawl I saw in Gravenhurst was at the Albion Hotel when Ronnie Hawkins came to
Oh,
perform.
wow, I can believe it.
Oh, it was fun.
Oh, now you
I
see,
wasn't in
I'm calling on your gentility here at this point and saying, wait a minute, it was fun. What do you mean? It was fun. Oh, it would be a riot, yeah. Literally. Not many of them. A lot of those performers at the Key were really, really top-notch people. And they weren't keen on performing on a big stage in an auditorium. They liked, bye-bye, Irene. They liked to perform in places like the Key, which had that feeling of it. You know, it was a place to go and dance. And oh, it was, exactly. It was Dunn's Pavilion. Yeah, it was Dunn's Pavilion. Yeah, and people could go there. So you had people like, oh gosh, Louis Armstrong and every big band you could name. And yeah, and they all played there, but people would dance. It wasn't like that very rigid theater situation that you have. No, it was activity. Yeah, everybody joined into that. And yeah, and I think that they were, now granted, there were a few people like Coleman Hawkins, for instance, played at the Key or at Dunn's Pavilion, but he also played at the Sands. When the Sands, because the Sands goes way, way back. I mean, it goes back all the way back to the beach bungalow, which is what it used to be out there. I mean, there's a whole long history of the Sands. Yeah, there were log cabins and all kinds of things. And it's right back to the 1920s. Yeah, so it's got a long history. And people like Coleman Hawkins would come and they would play with Huey Claremont and his group. And they would book in for a week and they would stay at the Sands and Coleman Hawkins would, wow, I would have loved to be there for that. Yeah. They did, the Sandsmen. Anything else that anybody, yes, sir. When it was the Empress? It was actually sold to, let me go back to John Sharp.
I'm just asking about that name now.
Oh, Chin, yeah.
Am I to assume correctly that's someone of Asian descent?
No,
Okay.
no, he was not.
Okay.
And that's interesting, isn't it?
I
Because
didn't know that
it
was
does,
at the time.
no, it does have that sound, but no, in fact, he wasn't. And interestingly enough, too, it was his wife who actually took over the management of the hotel when that deal to sell it to Gilmore fell through and they ended up re-owning it again for, gosh, at least 10 years. She took over the management of the hotel. And I gather that she was, what should we say, a bit of a rough rider in terms of staffing and, you know, behavior in the hotel and so on. So, yeah. Anything else?
I don't know anything about
No, any other questions? No questions from online? Okay. Well, I think then I will say good night to everyone. Thank you for coming. I appreciate it very much.
used to be a big sing up there. and
Oh, you're very welcome. My pleasure.
there was
Yeah. I've been to the dentist today. Canceled that. I didn't have it done, actually. They